Hi everyone, this is Riccardo Masini and this is Vlog, a very special episode of Vlog, an episode that will be made in English. So I am making this episode and I am making it in English after the great and funny and fantastic conversation I had with Dan Pancaldi and Fred Serval last week. I hope that that all of you have seen that episode in the No Enemies Here channel, YouTube channel. I am making the link. I am adding the link in the description below for those who have not seen that episode, that conversation, because it was really great, and I really thank you everyone who has watched that conversation and who left comments, and I replied to comments. Really great experience, and very nice to hear other people's and other wargamers from all around the world. That episode, that conversation was about the characteristics, the features of wargaming in Europe. We had Italy, myself, and France, but also we spoke about other countries in Europe and the relationship with wargaming, historical and fantasy wargaming, and simulation games in general. I wanted to make this episode in particular on my channel because I felt there was something to add to that conversation. Also, after having read some comments to that conversation, I was inspired to make this episode, and on a particular topic we covered during that conversation. That is the importance, the role of game magazines in the development of the wargaming world and wargaming hobby in our respective countries. We know United States and also on an international level we had great classic magazines like Strategy and Tactics, or the Wargamer, or Fire and Movement, and now we have their successors in Modern War, World at War, Counterfactual, Battles Magazine, and C3I Magazine by Roger B. McGowan. In France we have The Victis. This means that I think you can trace a history of wargaming in our respective countries if you analyze, if you examine, if you try to understand the history of game magazines. They are very precious historical sources, because when you see a game magazine from 1976 or 1983, you have a very precise idea of how the wargaming sector was working, what was happening to wargaming and gaming in general on that year. And this is also true for Italy. But I am not making this episode just about Italy. I will try to show you the most important game magazines and most significant game magazines in Italy from the 80s in this episode. But please bear in mind and try to find the similarities and the differences, but mostly the similarities between what has happened in Italy and what has happened in your country. Because the history of wargaming all over the world is quite similar in all of the but everywhere around the world. About Italy, now let's focus on Italy. You have an amazing series about Board Wargaming in Italy by Mauro Farina in his podcast Il Giannizzero Nero. The problem is that his podcast is in Italian. You have many protagonists, people who were there, who made the history of wargaming in our country, and who made magazines, who made articles, who made games. His podcast is in Italian. That is, Mauro's podcast is in Italian. This episode will be in English, but I am sure I will never be able to be as extensive as he is in his podcast, and I will surely forget someone. I'm sorry for that, but this will be a general exposition about gaming in Italy, and you will see that it has many points of contact, also with the gaming development, with the gaming history abroad, all over the world. So I made a name, Pergioco. Pergioco was, and it is, probably the first. Here I have the issue number 1, my family's collection. Pergioco is probably the first dedicated game magazine in Italy. It ran from 1980 to 1984. There had been other magazines before who dealt with war games, modelli militari, military models, but also articles about wargaming in mainstream magazines like L'Espresso or Panorama. To give you some reference, something like the New Yorker or Life magazine. But this was the first Italian magazine specialized and totally dedicated to gaming, and it was 1980. To give you an historical context of the situation of gaming in Italy around that year, if you wanted to buy a war game, an SPI war game, an SPI or Avalon Hill war game, you had to order it by conventional mail. If you were lucky, you could find an importer or a toy model shop with some boxes of those games. Otherwise, you had to go by conventional mail, and you had to wait for 3-4 weeks, maybe more, and pay really a lot for shipment if you wanted to order it directly to the US, and no internet. You had to know that war games existed, and game magazines, paper game magazines, sold in newsstand kiosks, newsstand shops on the streets, were the only means of communication. The only way that you could discover that there was something called war game. What had happened in Italy before 1980 in the gaming sector? There had been some books. There had been some first war games already published, and the most important was Corteo, and Corteo was about public demonstrations and public manifestations and riots in a modern city. It was a satirical game about politics. Politics in Italy during the 70s was very complicated. We had terrorism issue, and there was much violence and bombings too, and riots all over the country. And there had some books had been published. One of those books was Le Guerre di Carta, and here it is. Le Guerre di Carta, Paper Wars, was published in 1979, and if you look closely at the name of the author, you will see something familiar, because the name is Sergio Masini, and Sergio Masini is my dad. He he published this book thanks to a historian, a very famous and important historian in Italy, and his name was Giuseppe Galasso. And my father worked for him, and he introduced Galasso to wargaming. He loved wargaming, and he wrote an article about wargaming. And later was asked to write a book about it, but he said, no, I'm not really an expert. The expert is Sergio Masini, my father. And so he offered my father the opportunity to write a book about that. My father bought it. It was one of the first books about wargaming in Italy. There had been others, but this was the importance of it is that it was a mainstream book. It was a book for everyone, not just wargaming enthusiasts, military people from the armed forces or other historians. It was a book for everyone. So when in 1980 it was decided, a group of authors and the publishers decided to create a game magazine, Pergioco, he was the perfect candidate to run the regular column about wargames in Pergioco. But Pergioco was not just about wargames. Pergioco had a very broad approach to game in general. You had wargames, traditional games, chess, go, checkers, card games, origami, mahjong, bridge. You had ludology articles, you had articles about game history, about games in literature and philosophy, and about generic board games, from Monopoly to Risk to everything, riddles, everything that was related to games. You had also diplomacy and political simulations. The first articles about role-playing games. My father wrote one of the first articles about role-playing games in Italy. And it was Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, we said war games. Writing together with my father about war games was Marco Donadoni, and he was one of the founders of the international team. It was an Italian publisher, very, very important in the early 80s, and also known abroad. Richard Bagg wrote an article, not very kind, but however, about the first titles of the international team that yes had problems, but later titles were fantastic. We had Septima Legio, that is today we will call it a sci-fi sandbox. That is an exploration game, but set in a crossing between science fiction and ancient Roman history. You had the Solar Republic sending out starships on the galaxy, and in the solar system, outside the solar system, in our galaxy, exploring for other planets. But you also had Landsnet. Landsnet is actually a port of Craievok in the Renaissance period. Very, very interesting. You had games like Austerlitz, like Supermarina, games, oh yes, Yom Kippur, fantastic. And after also for war games wrote Joan Ingellis, and Ingellis was the founder of Strate Libri. It was a very important importer of war games in our country. And then came Andrea Angiolino and Gregorio Alleggi, and you know those names because they are the authors of Wings of Glory. They began writing on Pergioco about role-playing games, and later something else about military games. You had Agostino Carocci, which was the author of a very great, fantastic role-playing game that is Catacumbas, and also Sergio Valzania and Ugo Barlozzetti, two very important historians too. Ugo Barlozzetti and his miniature war games. Today he is the creator of many miniature dioramas in many museums around Italy, and also Pietro Cremona, Paolo Rodolfo Carraro, and Claudio Nardi, great experts of diplomacy. You know, I am making these names because I want those names to be well known also outside of Italy. I have this opportunity thanks to YouTube and my channel because they are very important. They are very close friends. Some of them are no longer with us, regretfully, but it is very important to make those names because they are very good people. They are very expert. They are very competent experts about war games and historical games in general, and history. Many of them are historians. That is why I said that we in Europe and Italy we have a closer relationship with history. That's why, because I had so many examples of historians who became wargamer. War games and historical research are very, very close here. As far as I could say that war games are actually considered a part of historical research by the military historians. And I am saying this because I am a member also of the Italian Military History Society, and we made many events about the relationship between war games and historical research with academic professors and scholars and historians. Now, but it is not just everything about Pergioco was not just about war games, it was about games in general. The main feature of Pergioco was that apart from some specialists, all of the name I made you happily passed from one type of game to another. There was no game tribalism. Remember for Korunke what he said, that he created coins also to fight game tribalism. There was no game tribalism in the early 80s in Italy. And I think also in the United States there was no game tribalism. There was game culture. There were games about history, the games about economy, the games about politics, abstract games, traditional games, role-playing games. There was no distinction, no rigid and fixed category. And Pergioco was built around that inspiration. You had articles about games inspired by TV series, yes, and also about the games designed by Palladium, who was a Renaissance architect in the same issue. You had games in literature, theater, philosophy. This is what I like to call the spirit of Pergioco. Something that is quite rare today. That is people who loved games because games were cultural products. Not because they are war games, they are X encounters, they are Euro games, they are German style games. Nobody cared too much to this, to categories. It was game culture. In general, the focus of Pergioco and of gaming in the early 80s, at least in Italy, was not just on games, but on gaming life. One of the first articles by my father, I think the first one for Pergioco, was about women and games. But all games, nothing ever changes. And also we had in later issues interviews with politicians and writers and journalists and their relationship with games. there was also a very innovative and experimental approach to gaming, and its most recent developments, like role-playing games, we already said that, electronic games, computer games, were making the first steps during those years, and more and more space for the many clubs and gaming groups who were developing all around Italy. I am looking at my notes, seeing if I forgot someone. Yes, surely there was. There are many names I am forgetting. I'm sorry for this. Those names are parts of my infancy. Many of them are my family friends. I was really a kid because I was born in 1977. So Pergioco is part of my, not of my adolescence like wargames. Wargames are not part of my adolescence. They are part of my infancy. That is probably one of the reasons for my very personal relationship with wargames. There were also controversial games. One of them was Mafia. It was about the mafia. Just like Corteo was about public demonstrations, and there had been, I don't remember if on Espresso or Panorama, a game about a golpe. It was called Golpe, a coup d'etat, a coup. A game where you had a nice map of Italy and you led some regiments in the army and had to stage a coup d'etat, a golpe. So you see, it was a very broad approach. There was a general academic and historical approach. And Pergioco was closer to the multidimensional and very broad approach of the French Stratégie magazine. Probably a bit closer to that than to traditional strategy and tactics. We also had the dominance, speaking about war games, strictly about war games, we had the dominance of SPI and Avalon titles. And later new companies showed up like GDW, Victory Games, and Western Games. Victory Games, not much. I think Victory Games was founded just when Pergioco handed Western Games. These names, all the shuffle of companies during those years. We were a bit late in the wake of the developments in the United States. What happened there, it took 1 year, more or less 6 months, 1 year to happen here, also here in Italy. So when SPI closed, we felt the impact of that, I'd say 6 months later. Regretfully, we had no social media, I already said, no internet, no Amazon, so we had no direct contact. Today, if something happens to Compass Games or GMT, I know that probably when it happens, because I see newsletter, tweets, and news. Back then, you had to wait quite a lot to understand what was happening at SPI or Avalon. Regretfully, economic troubles and most of all the distribution of magazines, because sales were quite good for Pergioco, because it also had insert games, and it also had specials for kids, special issues for kids. But economic troubles and most of all the distribution of the magazines struck Pergioco and closed the project on 1984. The project was no longer financially sustainable, also because Pergioco, yes, it had advertising, but I know many people who wrote for Pergioco, and if they wanted to give a review of a game and they did not like a game, they made it very clear. So it was not a simple advertising magazine. made very objective and precise critics to games. So Pergioco closed. And after Pergioco, I have to say that I think that the entire wargaming sector, not just here in Italy, but all abroad, all over the world, had something of a decline or a crisis. SPI closed, yes, but it was not just SPI closing because there were many other great companies. If I think about games in 1985, 1986, 1987, I see the more and more monster games. This means that the public was becoming more specialized, which is not a bad thing. The problem is that the public was shrinking. There were less and less wargamers, less and less titles. Yes, very detailed war games, very detailed titles, but war games were becoming the more and more a niche product. They had not been a niche product, and Pergioco was a proof of that, because on a mainstream magazine you had 6, 8, 10 pages about war games which were regularly read by mainstream readers. War games have begun also, especially in the US, as a popular hobby, and they were becoming the more and more specialist. You did not give a war game as a present to a 13 or 14 years old kid as had been in the 1970s. You gave him a role-playing game or other types of games. No more war games. Miniature war games persisted and flourished, also in Italy, but cardboard war games entered a critical period, a period which will end on in the early 2000s, I'd say. Only a few dedicated, I like to call them in Latin custodians, defended historical war games in specialized clubs, associations, conventions, and gaming stalls. But creating and maintaining a regular paper magazine about war games and games in general was actually becoming harder and more expensive. There was someone who tried. Andrea Angiolino tried with Giocaria. Andrea did its best, but could not reach the diffusion, the success his magazine deserved. Fanzines and club-based magazines persisted, and they were often linked to well-known game stores that stayed as regular meeting points for gamers. We had Agonistica here in Rome, linked to Strategia and Tattica, the shop of Roberto Flaibani, and we had Blitzkrieg linked to ioGiochi dei Grandi in Verona by Nando Ferrari. We had the shop Stratagemma in Florence, but they were really isolated cases, very important, very significant, but there was no longer a mainstream visibility for war games. We had an interesting magazine, a very interesting magazine, which was Chaos. Chaos was founded by Roberto Di Meglio. I think that also Andrea Angiolino worked and wrote some articles for Chaos. Chaos was focused on comics, role-playing games and fantasy gaming, but had also articles about historical gaming. But however, also Chaos at the end had to close down. There were also many great rivals to wargaming during that period. We had computer games, customizable card games, Magic the Gathering, and mainstream generic board games. And then you had the explosion of Eurogames and German-style games, and we are still today in that phase. And they were very attractive to the general public. Miniature games persisted, and they had very nice magazine here in Italy. It was called Dadi e Piombo, and had specialized conventions. Dadi e Piombo had also space for some cardboard war games, but during those years, we have to be honest and sincere, there was no Vevictis as there was in France. We had no Vevictis in Italy during those years. However, many conventions, many gaming conventions flourished. Gradara, the festival of Gradara, the game festival of Gradara in Central Italy, brought forward the cultural link of Pergioco with gaming, and Gradara had the public readings of Umberto Eco. You know him because he is the writer of The Name of the Rose. Roberto Benigni, Academy Award winner Roberto Benigni was at Gradara. Professor Luca Giuliano, a really good and close friend of mine, one of the greatest experts and critics of role-playing games and great author of role-playing games, is the author of the on-stage role-playing system. They were regular attendees at Gradara. And then there was Luca Comics and Games festival, and Expo Cartoon, another festival. Later Expo Cartoon became Romix. Expo Cartoon was here in Rome, created a powerful link with the Comics World, between games and comics world. Expo Cartoon was not exactly Romix, is a bit complicated. However, there are many gaming conventions, many sectors about games in comics conventions. And we had also, and this is very interesting, Modena Play. Modena Play began as ModCon, and ModCon was founded by the Club 3M. The Club 3M, Modena is in central Italy, a bit outside Bologna, and the Club 3M was born as a wargaming club. Very interesting. ModCon was a wargaming convention, and later became a mainstream gaming convention with Eurogames and others, and is quite large. You know, Lucca makes 100 and 200,000 attendees regularly each year. Modena is about 40 to 50,000 attendees, regular attendees. You know what? Also, Modena has an area about war games, the BG Storico, during these years has grown and has become much and much larger. Does it remember you something? Like Gen Con, and Gen Con began as a wargaming convention, and Insurrection by Harold Buchanan, this section about war games in Gen Con. And BG Storico is something like, think of it a bit like an Insurrection. BG Storico is maintained by the most important war game clubs here in Italy, by Giancarlo Ceccoli, San Marino Club, Mauro Faina, and Loris Lucchetti, Casus Belli of Latina, and many other clubs all around Italy. And then we mentioned San Marino, Giancarlo Ceccoli, who was one of the custodes, the custodians, if you remember, now makes the great specialized convention about wargaming in San Marino. The friends of Casus Belli make Gioco e Storia at Piana delle Orme, that is an historical museum with many World War II authentic vehicles, and tanks and trucks, many amazing stuff. And also we have today the Federazione Italiana Wargame, the FIV. The FIV, yeah, they make a convention which is called the FIV Day, and during the last convention in last October, October 2019, we had a wonderful conference about war games and historical research. I mentioned that. With the president and the secretary of the SISMO, the Italian Military History Society, but also with Balzania, Angiolino, Alleggi. Alleggi has become one of the greatest aviation historians in Italy, and many others. We had also international guests like Pergioco of MMP and Pascal Tupi of Exasim. You remember the historian Galasso. Once again, wargaming and historical research are very, very close, work very, very closely. And the world was going on. So we had many conventions. The world was going on. We had also, and then we began to have online magazines like ILSA, Informazione Ludica Scatola Aperta. I would say open box gaming information, very academic and ludologic, but however very, very interesting. We had online magazines because in later years we had the net, we had internet, we had social media, and then we had Kickstarter, we had YouTube channels, podcasts, websites and portals. There are two very important websites here in Italy about games in general, and they are Gioconomicon and Latana di Goblin. They're very, very interesting. They're in Italian, right? I wrote articles for Gioconomicon and made some podcasts with Latana di Goblin, and they are very, very, very extensive, and they're about gaming in general, but they have very interesting sections about wargaming. And we had an interesting phenomenon. A resurgence of articles about wargaming in paper magazines. Last example is in Guerre e Guerrieri. Once again, Mauro Faina and Casus Belli, who have a regular 4 pages, I think, on Guerre e Guerrieri. We have visibility on mainstream news channels, and we have paper game magazines. The circle is closing. In Pergioco we had the wargaming section and the general gaming approach. So it is quite fitting that today we have specialized magazines about wargames. They have a bit on the Vivictis model, but also different, and the main one is Parabellum, and it is a very, very nice game magazine about wargames, all wargames, and military history with insert games. About new wargames, but also vintage titles, traditional titles, very, very nice, and it also has expansions and variants for titles of many companies, especially for titles of Italian companies like Aces and Europa Simulazioni. However, really a lot of content. And then we have another magazine, a more generic, more mainstream one that is ioGioco. That is why I entitled this episode From Pergioco to ioGioco. ioGioco is a very interesting project. It is a generic magazine about gaming. So you find mostly Euro games or German style games or abstract games. However, it has has the more and more wargame content. It has had some specials about wargames. There was a special by Riccardo Vadalà on card-driven games. There were articles and reviews about Time of Crisis, the Italian edition of Time of Crisis by Ergoludo, and it was a very interesting version because it contained also the expansion Age of Iron and Rust. This time we Italians were luckier because we got the basic Time of Crisis game and Age of Iron and Rust expansion all together in one package. But it also has a regular column about wargames written by myself. I entitled that column The Die of Caesar, and I speak especially about wargames, not just military wargames. I'd say more about simulation games. So, for example, in the next issue that is going out just these days, I speak about political and military simulations, starting from Twilight Struggle, but I also speak about Democracy Under Siege, Europe Divided by David Thompson, Founding Fathers, John Company, Bleeding Kansas, once again controversial games like This Guilty Land by Olenspiele. Also, we had in ioGioco at least 2 games as insert games. The first one was, I think, on issue number 1, the first version of Blitzkrieg by Paolo Mori. It was published for the first time in the first version on ioGioco, and we are very proud of the results of the success that Paolo had with Blitzkrieg. Also, we had Ferro, Fango e Neve by Guglielmo Duccioli, which is a game which is a Euro game of war, I would say, about the Eastern Front. Very, very interesting. So, as you see, ioGioco is much different from Pergioco, but tries to represent games in a more comprehensive, in a more extensive and more open approach, not just by categories. There are more categories in ioGioco than in Pergioco, I would say, but Pergioco is growing and more is deepening its cultural contents and analysis. The last issue was about the evolution of the gaming sector in the last 20 years, from the year 2000 to today, and had also articles about psychological games and games in culture and in ancient illustrations. You see the cost of palladium is reappearing once again, so we are rebuilding that connection. We have very good specialized game magazines about war games and historical games in general, but we also have today, and we are very lucky to have good gaming magazines about gaming in general. And we have also, once again, books. We had in the 90s, I think in the 90s, or maybe a bit later, after the 2000, we had a book about Giancarlo Ceccoli of San Marino, La simulazione storica, with an article by Mark Hammond, The Philosophy of CDGs, of Card-Driven Games. But we also had many books about the history of games by Angiolino. We had a gaming encyclopedia by Andrea Angiolino and Beniamino Sidoti. Many books about role-playing games by Luca Giuliano. Many books about historical gaming by Sergio Valzania. And many books about the history and philosophy and symbolic games by Emiliano Sciarra. the author of Bang, names that you know as game designers, but they are also historians and scholars and professors and academic characters. And after all, we have also books by myself, just like Paper Wars 2.0. Here it is. That is the second edition of Paper Wars, and you know how much the wargaming sector has grown by comparing the depth and the dimensions of those two books. Here we are. In Paper Wars 2.0, I wrote it together with my father, so it is a family tradition. And also another book I made was Mettere in gioco il passato, Putting the past in gaming, which was about games and public history. And also we had an appendix to one of our military history books, The Battles That Changed the World by editor Rusconi, and the last chapter was about wargaming as a form of historical research, and that book was written once again by myself and by my father. So we are actually creating new studies. We are making new researches about gaming and historical gaming and simulation games in general. I think that in the next weeks it will be finally published, because we have had some problems as everyone. Ariadne's game, Il Gioco di Arianna, which is my book about non-linear simulation, that is simulation, multidimensional simulation, political, military and economic simulations, from the first experimental titles by SPI like The Plot to Assassinate Hitler and other titles like that, to the more recent Coins and the Great Statesman series by Mark Hamill, CDGs, but also fantasy games like Root, etc. That is complex simulations, multidimensional simulations. You know, and I have a surprise about that for our English-speaking readers and listeners. We'll see. However, the most important factor is not just one author, myself, other authors, many other authors writing about games, is that there is, once again, during the last years, there is once again a community of wargamers and historical gamers here in Italy. And that community is formed, lives around, rallies around gaming conventions, but also game magazines and game publications, books and magazines and articles about gaming. Many times those articles are made sometimes there are social media channels like this one, YouTube and podcasts, but also traditional paper channels. Not just websites, but it is very, very, very important to keep up studies in gaming, about gaming and wargaming, and book and analysis and extensive and deep researches and academic researches about gaming and wargaming. In the United States, we have so many great examples. I would say Zones of Control, which was fundamental, for example, for me to write Paper Wars 2.0, but also the works of Peter Perla, Caffrey, and Mark Hamill. Obviously, Danigan's The Complete Wargames Handbook. You know, it is not just about... Games are not just about playing, and especially simulation games. They are about representing and making a sense of reality, by simulating it. I said during Dan's conversation with Fred, simulation games are not about precise facts. They are about historical dynamics. That is, the inner workings, the inner mechanics, the deep dynamics of events. But if we really want to understand how to simulate those dynamics, we have to analyze how games work in an academic way, with a scientific method. This is not just about playing and knowing the last titles. We have to make questions. We have to ask questions to our games. How do they work? How do they represent and recreate reality and history? Which are the real inner and deeper dynamics? That is why I love so much Cleo's Corner by Mark Emmon in C3I, and his discussions about the kinetic representation, or what I will describe as non-linear representation. All of these analyses, they cannot be made just on a YouTube video. No, these YouTube video probably lasted too long. They have to be made on a book with academic mentions, with reciprocal mentions, with bibliography. Luckily for us, there are many who are making these researches, but many of those who are making today these researches, who are making these studies, they began as game designers, and they began as game designers because they began reading those game magazines. So please consider game magazines as a very important support and channel for wargaming. Everywhere in the world, in every year, they have always been fundamental to the development and the growth of wargaming. That is why I wanted to make this video, showing you some examples from Italy, because I wanted also these names to be known outside of Italy, because they deserve that, but also to stress out this important point for me, this significance of game magazines and books about games for the wargaming hobby, because we must we don't just have to play, we must play better, with more awareness, with more knowledge about what we are playing. So here is the episode is over at last. Maybe it was a bit long, but it was very important to me. I thank you. I thank you very much for having listened to this. And my English, I hope it is quite understandable. And I promise, I made that promise to many of you. I will make more episodes in English, because you are so kind to ask me. And really, I wanted to stay in touch with my international friends, especially with my American friends of commercial modern war games who are born in the United States. It is always a pleasure for me to speak in English and to American friends and war games and game designers. I'm honored by that. I'm really taken away by that, but I've had the pleasure of speaking with Kevin Zucker, David Thompson, Harold Buchanan, and Herman Latman, and many others. So it is always a pleasure of having interesting conversation with you, with game designers and other players all around the world. So I will make more episodes in English. I thank you for having followed me, for having seen this episode up to here, up to the end. Rest the end, and as I always say, in Italian it is niente paura, sono solo war games, and in English is don't be scared, it's just war games. Bye, ciao.